Picture this. It's a blistering July morning in 1518. You're wandering the cobblestone streets of Strasbourg, a bustling city in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. Merchants shout over their wares, children chase each other through the squares, and the day feels perfectly ordinary until you turn a corner. What you see will never leave you. A woman is dancing in the middle of the street, not with joy, but with a frantic, nightmarish energy. Her shoes are torn open, her feet slick with blood, her dress clings to her, heavy with sweat, her eyes burn with the desperation of someone trapped inside their own body, unable to stop. Her name is Frau Troffea, and she's about to unleash one of history's strangest and most terrifying outbreaks of mass hysteria. What began with one woman's uncontrollable movements would soon spread to hundreds, sweeping through Strasbourg like a curse. This was no celebration, no festival. It was a plague. And it didn't kill with infection, but with exhaustion, heart failure, and the sheer, horrifying inability to stop dancing. This is the true story of the dancing plague of 1518, a medical mystery so strange that modern science still can't fully explain it, and so terrifying it exposes the darkest corners of human psychology and medieval life. Before we dive in, if you love uncovering history's hidden horrors, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I think it's incredible that we can explore these ancient stories together, connected across time and space by curiosity. On July 14, 1518, a woman named Frau Troffea stepped into the narrow street outside her home in Strasbourg, and then she began to dance. But calling it dancing is almost an insult to the word. This was something else, something violent, unnatural. Witnesses said her movements were jerky, chaotic, like a puppet yanked by invisible strings. Her arms snapped and flailed in directions that had no rhythm, no reason. Her legs pounded the cobblestones so hard that chips of stone flew loose beneath her feet. Sweat poured down her body, her shoes split open, blood stained the street. And the most horrifying part, she couldn't stop. Hour after hour, her body convulsed, locked in a frenzy that looked less like celebration and more like possession. When concerned neighbors rushed to her side, Frau Troffea shoved them away, her body twisting and writhing with a will of its own. When someone offered her water, she tried to drink, but her hands never stilled. Most of it spilled down her chin and soaked her dress as she thrashed. By midday, the July sun scorched the cobblestones. The heat was merciless, and yet her movements only grew more violent. Sweat poured from her skin, staining her clothes and pooling in dark patches around her feet. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest heaving, her body trembling with exhaustion, yet still she could not stop. The most disturbing detail comes from eyewitnesses. She was trying to stop. Her face contorted with terror and despair. Between jerks and spasms, she cried out in German, begging for help, pleading with God to free her from the invisible chains that bound her. But her body betrayed her. She was a prisoner inside her own flesh, forced to watch as her limbs flailed in a grotesque parody of dance. By evening, a crowd had gathered. Whispers spread through the streets. Some insisted she was possessed by demons. Others muttered about a witch's curse. A few blamed ergot, a toxic fungus in rye bread that could cause hallucinations and convulsions. But none of these theories explained the horrifying truth. Frau Troffea simply could not stop. Night fell. Torches were lit, casting long shadows over her trembling figure. Neighbors took turns watching over her, draping blankets across her shoulders when she shivered, offering food she could not eat, whispering prayers over her as she staggered and twisted in what seemed like her own private hell. And then, her nightmare spread. What happened next defies all rational explanation and plunges straight into the realm of mass psychological horror. On the second day of Frau Troffea's ordeal, a neighbor named Herr Lauser began to feel an odd, restless energy. At first it was just a nervous twitch in his legs, a compulsion to pace, the sense that sitting still was unbearable. But within hours, that twitching grew into something far more sinister. Herr Lauser could no longer resist. He began to dance. Unlike Frau's violent thrashing spasms, his movements were eerily graceful. He waltzed with invisible partners, arms raised as if holding someone who wasn't there. He spun and stepped in patterns that followed a strange, internal rhythm. A phantom orchestra playing only in his mind. Now there were two. The sight of them, one writhing in agony, the other spinning as if in a ghostly ballroom, stopped Strasbourg in its tracks. Merchants abandoned their stalls, children hushed, priests hurried from the cathedral, desperate to see what many whispered was either a miracle or the work of the devil himself. But the true horror had only begun. By the third day, 6 more people were caught in the grip of the curse. By the end of the first week, more than 30 residents of Strasbourg had lost control of their bodies, each one moving to a rhythm no one else could hear. Some flailed like Frau Troffea, wild and violent. Others glided like Herr Lauser, elegant but equally trapped. A few marched stiffly, saluting invisible commanders to the beat of phantom drums. And some stomped and clapped as if celebrating a festival no one else could see. Different dances. Same terror. What united them all was the same horrifying truth. They could not stop. Their eyes pleaded for release, their mouths cried out for help, but their bodies betrayed them. Puppets caught in a nightmare without strings, and the spread was no accident. The pattern soon became clear. It wasn't random. Those who lingered too long in the crowd, watching the dancers with morbid fascination, were the ones most likely to be next. The plague was contagious, not through touch but through sight. Families who tried to care for afflicted relatives quickly discovered a chilling truth. Watching too closely meant risking infection themselves. Within days, husbands, wives, and children of the dancers found their own bodies betraying them, swept into the same grotesque rhythm. It was as though the plague passed not through touch or blood, but through sight alone. Dr. Johann Weyer, a visiting physician, captured the nightmare in his journal. "I have seen plagues that rot flesh and shatter bone, but this is a plague of the soul. It travels from the eye to the mind, and from the mind to the body, turning rational men and women into slaves of motion they cannot resist or comprehend." And then came the city's response. An act of well-meaning ignorance that transformed horror into catastrophe. Strasbourg's council, desperate for solutions, consulted physicians, priests, and civic leaders. Their conclusion now seems absurd, but in the framework of medieval medicine, it was perfectly logical. The dancers were sick because they weren't dancing properly. The cure, they decided, was more dancing. The theory was rooted in the belief of hot blood, that the afflicted were fevered with corrupted humors, and the only way to purge them was to let the body sweat it out through continuous motion. Dance until the illness burned itself away. So the authorities built a wooden stage in the city square. They hired musicians to play day and night. They even brought in professional dancers from neighboring towns, believing that if the sick learned proper steps, their chaotic movements might fall back into harmony and the madness would end. Instead, it unleashed hell. The pounding drums, the shrill pipes, the steady lutes gave the afflicted a rhythm to cling to. What had once been chaotic thrashing became synchronized frenzy. Their movements grew sharper, faster, more violent. The crowd swelled, the stage shook, and the streets filled with bodies locked in the same horrific ballet. And then came the final cruelty. The musicians and professional dancers brought in to heal soon found themselves unable to stop. One by one, they joined the ranks of the damned, drawn into the same unstoppable compulsion that had already claimed so many. The cure had become the disease. What had been intended as treatment quickly became recruitment for the plague. The wooden stage, built to contain the dancers in one place, instead became a magnet that drew even larger crowds. And with those crowds came more victims. The professional music, echoing through the streets of Strasbourg, seemed to trigger the compulsion even in people who had never laid eyes on the afflicted. Within days of implementing this so-called cure, the number of dancers exploded, from 30 to over 100. The city square descended into something out of Dante's Inferno. Dozens of bodies jerking and stamping in endless motion, musicians playing without pause, terrified that if they stopped, the dancers would grow even more violent, and crowds of horrified citizens watching, knowing that even observing too long might seal their own fate. Chroniclers later wrote that it was as if hell itself had opened upon the earth. The sound was inescapable, 100 pairs of feet pounding on wood, music shrieking frantically into the night, punctuated by cries of agony as dancers collapsed from pain, their bodies refusing to obey them even in their last moments of strength. And then the death toll began. The human body is not built for continuous, uncontrolled movement day after day. On the 7th day of the plague, Frau Troffea, the woman who had begun it all, collapsed mid-spin. She never rose again. The official record listed her cause of death as exhaustion of the heart. But witnesses described something far more haunting, her face twisted in terror, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if even in death her body still fought against invisible strings. The plague had claimed its first victim, and it would not be the last. According to eyewitnesses, Frau Troffea didn't simply collapse, she danced herself to death. Her final movements grew erratic and frenzied, her body lashing out as if shackled by invisible chains. Her breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one nearly swallowed by the violent spasms that racked her frame. When at last she crumpled to the ground, the horror wasn't over. Her limbs continued to twitch and jerk for several minutes, as though the compulsion to dance was stronger than life itself. And Frau Troffea was only the beginning. Medical records from Strasbourg read like entries from a medieval nightmare. Victims dropped one after another. Some died of heart failure, their organs simply giving out under the relentless strain. Others succumbed to strokes, their brains starved of oxygen as their bodies funneled every ounce of energy into motion. Most chilling of all were the cases medieval physicians described as exhaustion of the soul. These victims didn't die screaming or thrashing, they simply dimmed. Their eyes went vacant, their faces drained of all expression, yet their bodies kept moving, locked in mechanical rhythm until, like broken clockwork, they wound down into silence. The dancers could not eat. Food slipped from trembling hands before it reached their mouths. They could not sleep, muscles spasmed even as they collapsed from fatigue. They could barely drink. Each attempt risked choking as their throats convulsed with motion. Dr. Paracelsus, who arrived in Strasbourg at the height of the plague, documented their deterioration with chilling detail. He wrote of dancers whose feet had worn down to raw, bloody stumps, whose joints popped from their sockets under the strain, whose muscles consumed themselves from the inside out in a grotesque feast of self-destruction. Some developed what he called the dance fever. Their body temperatures spiked to lethal levels from ceaseless exertion, driving them into delirium and hallucinations. In their madness, their movements grew sharper, wilder, more violent, until their bodies finally gave way. The plague was no longer a curiosity. It was death, disguised as dance. By the end of July 1518, Strasbourg was collapsing under the weight of the plague. Dozens were dead. Hundreds more staggered through the streets, their bodies consumed by the compulsion. The city was running out of healthy citizens to care for the afflicted. Shops stood shuttered, trade ground to a halt, and terrified families fled to neighboring towns. What began as a strange curiosity had become a civic catastrophe. Desperate for answers, 16th century minds turned to the frameworks they knew best: faith, humors, and superstition. The most popular explanation among religious authorities was demonic possession. Priests pointed to the dancers' imperviousness to prayer, their refusal to stop when confronted with holy relics, and the contagious nature of the condition as proof that Satan's hand was at work. Father Heinrich Kramer, the infamous author of Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, personally investigated the Strasbourg outbreak. His conclusion? The city had fallen victim to a coordinated curse cast by a coven of witches bent on destroying Christendom. His solution was chilling: mass witch trials and executions. Fortunately, the city council rejected his recommendation, sparing Strasbourg a second plague of bloodshed. Medical authorities of the time leaned on the theory of hot blood, believing that excessive heat in the body needed to be purged through sweating and exertion. This flawed logic was what had driven the city to hire musicians and build dance stages, measures that had only worsened the outbreak. Others suggested ergot poisoning from contaminated rye bread. Ergot contains alkaloids similar to LSD, capable of causing hallucinations, convulsions, and frenzied behavior, but the theory had holes. If the plague came from food, why did it spread through sight, infecting even those who had never eaten the same bread? A few physicians invoked melancholia, the medieval cousin of depression. They argued the afflicted, many of whom came from Strasbourg's poorest districts and had endured famine, disease, and crushing poverty, were expressing suicidal despair through motion. To them, the dance was self-destruction disguised as movement. And then there were the astrological explanations. Some chroniclers blamed the alignment of the stars and planets in July 1518, insisting that celestial forces had heated the blood of Strasbourg's citizens, driving them into madness. Today, historians and scientists dismiss demonic curses and planetary alignments, but the mystery remains unsolved. Was it truly ergot poisoning, triggering mass hallucinations? Was it mass psychogenic illness, a form of psychological contagion in which hysteria spreads socially, infecting entire communities with symptoms that are very real, even if rooted in the mind? The dancing plague of 1518 continues to defy a single, neat explanation. It remains perched at the intersection of biology, psychology, and culture, a reminder of how fragile the human mind can be when gripped by fear, hardship, and belief. The year 1518 had been marked by strange omens in the skies, including a brilliant appearance of what we now know as Halley's Comet. Astrologers at the time argued that such celestial disturbances had unleashed evil influences upon the earth, and that the dancing plague was one of their dark manifestations. Modern science rejects the astrological explanation, but the theories it offers are no less unsettling. The leading explanation today is mass psychogenic illness, a collective psychological breakdown triggered by extreme social stress. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city on the edge, plagued by famine, disease, and political unrest. In that environment, the dancing plague may have been the body's unconscious response to trauma, a community-wide collapse of both mind and flesh. This idea is reinforced by the fact that most victims came from the poorest districts. Many had recently endured personal tragedies, and the contagion spread primarily through observation, all classic signs of a hysteria epidemic. Other researchers point toward neurological causes. They cite illnesses such as encephalitis lethargica or sleeping sickness, which can create compulsive movement disorders. A viral infection attacking the brain's motor control centers might, in theory, explain what unfolded in Strasbourg. Another possibility is an early form of conversion disorder, in which deep psychological trauma manifests as physical symptoms. The afflicted may have been expressing despair, hopelessness, and grief through the only outlet they had left, uncontrolled movement. But perhaps the most chilling modern theory is that the dancing plague was an early case of social contagion. The idea that emotions, behaviors, and even suffering can spread from person to person like an infection. In this sense, Strasbourg's dancers were not merely victims of disease or madness, but a mirror of something far more human. The terrifying ease with which despair can ripple through a society, turning individual pain into collective catastrophe. In our hyper-connected modern world, we see echoes of the same phenomenon in viral social media challenges, mass panics, conspiracy theories, and even outbreaks of violence. The dancing plague of 1518 may well have been humanity's first recorded example of an idea becoming literally contagious, spreading from mind to mind and manifesting as physical compulsion. And then finally, the dance came to an end. Not through medicine, not through prayer or exorcism, but through one of the strangest prescriptions in medical history, a pilgrimage. By early August, with the death toll rising and Strasbourg's economy collapsing, city leaders abandoned every previous strategy. Instead, they ordered a mass pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Vitus in the nearby town of Hohenstein. Saint Vitus was an unusual choice. He was the patron saint of dancers and actors, but also the one invoked against Saint. Vitus's dance, the medieval name for neurological disorders like Huntington's disease that caused involuntary movements. The logistics were staggering. Over 400 afflicted men, women, and children had to be transported, many restrained in carts and wagons, others staggering on foot, still thrashing in endless motion. Dozens of healthy citizens were hired to hold them down during the journey. The procession that left Strasbourg on August 3rd, 1518, was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Witnesses described a miles-long caravan of bodies, some tied to carts, some staggering beside them, moving as if pulled by invisible strings. Families wept. Priests clutched relics and whispered prayers. Physicians scribbled notes, baffled. And all the while, the dancers convulsed, their shoes slapping the road, their chains rattling, their voices rising in cries that mingled with the groan of wooden wheels. The sound, they said, carried for miles a chorus of feet, screams, prayers, and sobs. Humanity's desperation turned into a single, unholy rhythm. What happened at the shrine defies rational explanation, even by medieval standards. According to sworn testimony from city officials and multiple eyewitness accounts, something extraordinary occurred when the afflicted reached the altar of Saint Vitus. One by one, the dancers were led before the shrine and blessed by the priests. Their movements did not stop instantly, nor did they collapse in dramatic fashion. Instead, their bodies seemed to slowly unshackle themselves from an invisible force. The thrashing grew less violent, the spasms became less frequent. Over the course of hours, the relentless motion dwindled until at last it ceased altogether. Dr. Johann Vahr, who accompanied the pilgrimage to record the outcome, left this account. "I have seen many things in my practice that challenge understanding, but I have never witnessed so clear a demonstration of the power of faith over flesh. Whether by divine intervention or the hidden workings of the mind, the curse that had gripped these people for weeks was broken in a single day." By the evening of August 4th, fewer than a dozen dancers remained afflicted. By the following morning, the dancing plague of 1518 was over. The aftermath was almost as surreal as the plague itself. Hundreds of men and women who had been prisoners of their own bodies suddenly found themselves free, but forever changed. Survivors bore deep psychological scars. Many suffered what we would now call post-traumatic stress, nightmares, depression, and a profound terror of music or rhythmic sound. Some withdrew from society entirely, afraid that hearing a melody or drumbeat might drag them back into the nightmare. The physical toll was equally devastating. Weeks of ceaseless motion left bodies broken beyond repair, feet worn down to the bone, joints shattered, muscles wasted away. The city of Strasbourg was left not only with dozens of dead, but with a generation of survivors who could never fully escape the memory of dancing themselves to the edge of death. Months of uncontrolled movement left many survivors permanently damaged. Joint deformities, torn muscles, and weakened hearts plagued them for the rest of their lives. Some never regained the ability to walk normally, but the physical toll paled beside the psychological scars. Survivors described the most disturbing part as the loss of control. They remembered everything, the crowds, the prayers, the endless motion, but felt as if they had been passengers in their own bodies, conscious yet powerless. That sense of lost agency haunted them long after the plague ended, eroding their trust in their own minds and bodies. The city of Strasbourg itself carried the trauma. For years afterward, public dancing was banned outside of tightly controlled religious festivals. Street musicians were required to obtain permits, and any melody deemed too rhythmic or enticing could lead to arrest. The wooden stage that had once amplified the horror was dismantled and burned, its ashes scattered as the square was consecrated to prevent recurrence. The economic cost was staggering. Nearly 15% of Strasbourg's adult population was lost to death, disability, or mass emigration. Whole neighborhoods were abandoned as families fled in fear. It would take more than a decade for the city to claw its way back to prosperity. And yet the memory could not be purged. Word of Strasbourg's ordeal spread across Europe, inspiring both terror and morbid fascination. Over the next decades, reports of smaller but eerily similar outbreaks surfaced in at least a dozen other cities. Chroniclers began to record them not as isolated tragedies, but as signs of a deeper, more frightening truth about the human mind and its power to turn belief, fear, and despair into physical torment. The dancing plague of 1518 left scars not just on its victims, but on the very way medieval Europe thought about mass gatherings, public health, and the fragile boundary between body and mind. It was one of the first recorded moments in history when authorities began to recognize that the mind could inflict real illness upon the body, an early accidental step toward what would one day evolve into psychiatry. But the question remains, are we still dancing? The dancing plague of 1518 may look like a bizarre medieval anomaly, yet its echoes reverberate uncomfortably through our modern world. Today, ideas spread faster than ever before, carried not by word of mouth in crowded squares, but by the endless feed of social media. And with them come new forms of collective compulsion. Think of viral challenges. The Ice Bucket Challenge may have started harmlessly, but others, like the Tide Pod Challenge or the Momo Challenge, pushed people toward dangerous, even life-threatening behavior. The pattern is the same as Strasbourg. An idea spreads through observation. People know the risks, yet feel compelled to join, and soon the behavior takes on a life of its own, rippling far beyond its origins. Mass hysteria still thrives in our supposedly rational age. In 2016, the clown sightings panic swept across multiple countries. Thousands reported sinister clowns lurking in public spaces, despite little to no physical evidence. Fueled by social media and fear, the phenomenon became a genuine public safety crisis, born almost entirely from psychological contagion. Even more unsettling are modern outbreaks of mass psychogenic illness, events where communities suddenly experience physical symptoms without any organic cause. In schools, factories, and even entire towns, groups of people have collapsed, convulsed, or developed tics, all triggered not by poison or disease, but by the mind's mysterious and terrifying ability to spread suffering like an infection. In 2011, dozens of teenage girls in Leroy, New York, suddenly developed tics, twitches, and involuntary vocalizations that spread rapidly through their social networks. In 2012, more than 200 factory workers in Cambodia collapsed with convulsions, halting production for days. These modern dancing plagues follow the same eerie pattern as Strasbourg in 1518. They strike populations already under stress. They spread through social connection. They produce very real physical symptoms, and they defy conventional medical treatment. What's most unsettling is the realization that our hyper-connected digital age may make us even more vulnerable to these outbreaks, not less. Social media allows ideas, fears, and compulsions to spread with unprecedented speed and reach. We may be only one viral video away from our own 21st century version of the dancing plague. The citizens of Strasbourg in 1518 could not fathom how an idea could become contagious. Their world moved at the pace of horses and word of mouth. And yet, they witnessed one of history's most dramatic examples of social contagion consuming an entire city, We live in a world where information travels at the speed of light, reaching billions simultaneously. Our sciences of psychology, neurology, and sociology are far more advanced, yet the same phenomenon still stalks us. The truth is that human consciousness is far more fragile and far more interconnected than we like to admit. The dancing plague of 1518 reminds us that the boundary between the individual and the collective is thin, and under the right conditions of stress, fear, and pressure, entire communities can lose their grip on reality, dancing together into madness. In the end, the dancing plague of 1518 stands as both historical curiosity and modern warning. It exposes the terrifying fragility of human consciousness and the devastating power of social contagion. Frau Troffea stepped into the street in Strasbourg because something within her, psychological trauma, neurological illness, or perhaps something we will never fully understand, compelled her to move. What began as her private torment became a collective nightmare, not because her neighbors were weak or gullible, but because human beings are social creatures, bound together in ways we still don't fully comprehend. The hundreds who joined her weren't hysterics. They were ordinary citizens, battered by famine, disease, and political upheaval. They became victims of one of the most basic forces of human psychology, our tendency to mirror the behavior of those around us. The dancing ended at the shrine of St. Vitus, but the conditions that sparked it never truly vanished. Social stress, inequality, political turmoil, and the universal human hunger for meaning and belonging still shape our world. If anything, they are more intense now than they were in 1518. We may not dance ourselves to death in city squares, but the rhythms are still there. Viral challenges, conspiracy theories, mass panics, waves of extremism. The tempo has changed, but the underlying mechanism is the same. The people of Strasbourg learned the hardest possible way that ideas can be contagious, that consciousness is fragile, and that the line between the individual and the collective can collapse without warning. They learned it through blood, through exhaustion, and through the relentless rhythm of feet that could not stop moving. The question is, what will it take for us to learn the same lessons? And when the next plague begins, whatever form it takes, will we recognize it before it's too late to stop the dance? Perhaps the most chilling truth about the dancing plague of 1518 is that even after 500 years, we still don't know why it started or why it stopped. With all our science and technology, the event remains shrouded in mystery. That fact alone reveals something deeply unsettling about human nature. There are forces within our collective psychology that we do not fully understand. Forces that can override reason, compel the body, and spread like fire through entire communities. These are contagions of the mind, moving faster than any virus and sometimes proving just as deadly. The dancers of Strasbourg are long gone, but their story lingers as a warning. We are not as rational, independent, or in control as we tell ourselves. We are social creatures, fragile and interconnected, always vulnerable to the same forces that once turned a thriving city into a living hell. And somewhere, in some community buckling under stress and fear, the next dance may already have begun.